Hello, fourth grade. It's Monday, the 18th of May, 2020, and this is our history time. We're starting a new history unit. This is probably our last history unit of the year. And so we're looking at chapter 12 entitled New Steps Forward. Okay, so we're going to begin looking from page 168 to page 268 to 274. So we have quite a bit to read today. So I'm just going to get started. So here, the general introduction, you can look, I'm looking at the pictures there. It says, progress doesn't always mean building houses or roads. Sometimes it means making life better for people. In the 1960s and 1970s, Californians worked hard to stop the discrimination that had long been a part of the state's history. Sometimes the battles were difficult, but they made California a better place for everyone. Okay, so we see here, it says, California has led the way in education. The state opened up its college and university system to all students who make good grades, so no matter where you're from. And here, the United States government changed its laws to allow more Asians and other immigrants into the country. Here you see in that picture. Over here we have, today California sells many items like produce to countries along the Pacific Rim. Trade helps California's industries grow and provides many jobs. Okay, so we have avocados there. And it says up here, the many murals or wall paintings found throughout Los Angeles show the pride of the city's different ethnic groups and cultures. So this is Chicano pride, which is Mexican-American pride. All right, and you have a timeline down there. Timeline, it says 1980, personal computers begin to sell in great numbers, causing a boom in California's Silicon Valley. So my dad worked with computers, and the computer fit into a room. It was a big, huge room, and the computer was as big as the room, basically. Now you have your own little, like I have my own laptop. It's plugged in, or I'd show it to you, okay? So that's when personal computers, 1980, I was a senior in high school at that time. And then in 1986, on the timeline at the bottom, it says California admits 21,984 immigrants from Southeastern Asia. Immigrants from this region pour into the state throughout the 1980s, making Southeast Asian California's fastest growing immigrant population, okay, at that time. So lesson 1 is entitled A Struggle for Rights. So with all these different people coming into California, we need to make sure that nobody is discriminated against, that everybody has a fair chance to come into our nation and live their lives in peace and in freedom. But we know that people need to come into our country illegally. Okay, there's steps to take and whatnot. God is not a God of chaos. He's a God of order. So it says a struggle for rights. So it says our thinking focus, what civil rights did minorities fight for during the 1960s and 70s? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what civil rights means. The key terms are civil rights, minority, protest, labor union, strike, and boycott. Okay. It says most people knew the frightening name of Alcatraz. The prison that stood on the island of Alcatraz in San Francisco Bay once held the nation's most dangerous criminals. Escape was said to be impossible, okay, because it was out kind of on an island. I've visited Alcatraz. I don't think it's open to the public anymore, but it was like a museum. But the prison had closed in 1963, and the 50 Indians who took a boat to Alcatraz in November 1969 wanted to get on the island, not to escape from it. In the dark of night, they went ashore and climbed the island's rocky walls. Then they set up camp around the deserted prison. The Indians had taken over Alcatraz. The group called itself Indians of All Tribes. They were angry because the government was trying to take away their land and move them into cities. The Indians' culture was tied to their land. They don't want to live in cities. They wanted to live in open land like the country. They wanted the right to live in their own way and their own traditions, with their own traditions, The Indians held the island for nearly 2 years. Sleeping in the empty prison cells and looking over open fires, they had hoped to build a center for the study of Indian culture on Alcatraz. But the government would not sell them the island. The Indians may have lost Alcatraz, but they had captured the nation's attention. Now people everywhere knew about the troubles of the Indians. Okay, so there's a picture here of a teepee. Many people from San Francisco helped the Indians to stay on the island. They sent food, water, and clothing. So Alcatraz was was near San Francisco, off the coast of San Francisco, it said. And it was, like it was said, a very notorious prison full of the country's worst criminals. And I had been there on it's now like a museum, historical landmark, and I had been there. And it's really intense place. And it was considered, you couldn't escapable. There was no way to escape from it. There were said to be sharks in the waters, and you couldn't swim to the shore if you happen to get out, and etc. But the main point there is that the Indians in that area that were being forced to live in cities wanted to live in the country. They live off the land, and so they set up camp at Alcatraz, and then they were obviously, it got the nation's attention. So the Indians, it said, held the island for nearly 2 years, sleeping in the empty prison cells because, they took over Alcatraz and all the people were gone because it was shut down, because it was such a horrible prison. They would cook over open fires, but the government would not give them the island, and so they lost that place to stay. And we've talked about how the Indians' rights were so taken over in American history, and they've been a people that have really struggled because of that. So before we go on, so that was our introduction, I want to look at our 12 Lesson 1, support transition. Our vocabulary words are integration, riot, organize, and contracts. Okay, and then it's words that are scrambled and you unscramble them. What means a written agreements. Number 2, bringing people of all ethnic groups together. Which vocabulary is that? Word is that? Number 3, to form into a group in order to work together. What vocabulary word is that? Number 4, disturbance created by a large number of people. What vocabulary word is that? And then in essential facts, it says number 1, Indians of all tribes. Number 2, Otis Jackson. Number 3, Rosa Parks. We know that name. Number 4, Watts. Number 5, Yvonne Bratworth Burke. Number 6, Cesar Chavez. Number 7, Grape Boycott. Okay, so those are the people or terms, and here are the definitions of those things. A, she refused to give up her seat to a white person on a bus in Alabama. We already know that answer. B, he helped farm workers form a labor union. C, many Americans did this to show their support for farm workers. D, a white person refused to sell him a house. E, she was the first black woman elected to Congress from California. F, this black neighborhood experienced terrible violence in 1965. And G, this group took over Alcatraz Island, okay? So we already know the answer for number 1. We just talked about that. The answer for number 1. On the back, page 2, it says review. Number 1, what do we call the basic freedoms of all citizens? Is it A, a labor union, B, a boycott, C, civil rights, or D, discrimination? Number 2, you have a pie chart here. It says, look at the graph. Which of the following ethnic groups is the largest? F, Asian American, G, African American, H, Hispanic American, or J, Native American? Which group of ethnic group is the largest? Number 3, what minority groups protested against unfair treatment during the 1960s and 1970s? A, blacks, farm owners, and whites. B, Indians, whites, and blacks. C, migrant workers and government workers. D, blacks, migrant workers, and Indians. Number 4, why did blacks fight for equal rights? Number 1, blacks had not been treated fairly. F, blacks had not been treated fairly. G, there weren't enough laws against discrimination. H, blacks were not allowed to go to school. Or J, black leaders wanted to take over Alcatraz. Number 5, how did Cesar Chavez help the farm workers? A, he got them new jobs. B, he hired them to work on his farm. C, he worked with the farm owners. Or D, he organized the farm workers into a union. Okay, so a lot of really important information there. So let's start on page 271 with blacks seek equal rights. The Indians were not the only people who were tired of being treated unfairly. People like Otis Jackson were tired of it too. In 1963, Jackson, a 30-year-old lawyer, tried to buy a house in a Los Angeles suburb. But because Jackson was black, the owner refused to sell him the house. Such discrimination was not unusual. Many whites did not want black Americans in their suburbs, in new suburbs, in their neighborhoods, in other words. They refused to sell or rent houses to blacks. Blacks were also kept out of the higher paying jobs and the better schools. In the 1940s and 1950s, blacks tried to stop discrimination by getting the government to pass new laws. But these new laws were often ignored. It seemed as if all their work had been for nothing. So in the 1960s, many more blacks fought for their civil rights, their freedoms as citizens. So in our book, when they say blacks, they're referring to African Americans. They don't mean any disrespect. Okay, so just know that. I wouldn't read you something that I didn't feel good about. And so we heard a bunch of stuff. We have a bunch of answers there. Number 2, in Essential Facts, on the bottom of the first page, we see Otis Jackson. And so mark what Otis Jackson was trying to do, the Los Angeles lawyer, find in column B. And it also can answer on the second page, what do we call the basic freedoms of all citizens? Okay, so we heard both of those answers. What are the basic freedoms called of all citizens, which everyone should have, no matter what the color of their skin is, or what their ethnic group is, what their background, where they were from, where their ancestors were from, etc. And we can also understand the who Otis Jackson was. Okay, so we've read about that. I want you to read, we're going to read about understanding civil rights on the bottom of page 271. It says, Otis Jackson wanted the freedom to live where he chose. Rosa Parks wanted freedom to sit anywhere on a bus. Both fought for their civil rights. Like many African Americans living in Alabama in 1955, Mrs. Parks tried to stop discrimination by changing laws. After work one day, Mrs. Parks got on a bus to pay her fare and sat down in the part of the bus where African Americans had to sit. The bus started to fill up. There weren't enough seats in the section where whites sat. Get up, the driver ordered her. Mrs. Parks decided to try to stop discrimination by not moving. She was arrested and put into jail. Her protest was one of the early organized protests for civil rights. Turn to page 319 to read about a Supreme Court case on civil rights. So if you want to look that up later. Civil rights are the freedoms that the laws of the United States give to each citizen. Again, we're hearing an answer. For example, people have the right to say what they think, to practice their religion, and to own land. All our citizens must be treated equally and fairly. In the 1960s and 1970s, many more people spoke up for their civil rights. Women fought for their right to work in jobs such as judges, TV reporters, and doctors. These jobs were usually given to men. Americans today continue to fight for their civil rights. So we can start to see the answer for number 3 on the second page. What minority groups protested against unfair treatment during the 1960s and 70s? So we've heard a few things there about fighting for their civil rights. It says, how do we know? I'm right here on page 272. History. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. described his dream of equal rights for all people in a beautiful and famous speech in 1963. The speeches from the 1960s of King and many other black leaders tell us about the sufferings of blacks. Their words still guide the leaders of today. And then you see the picture here. In describing the picture, it says, an African-American woman holds a sign calling for integration. Blacks were fighting for equality in schools. They protested to stop discrimination in America. Let's turn the page. Civil rights include such freedoms as voting, saying what you believe, and living where you want. Across the country, blacks and non-blacks join in the struggle for civil rights. The civil rights struggle in California. So here we see blacks, whites, and other groups joined in this civil rights protest. Okay. Let's see if we have any more answers there. So the civil rights struggle in California. I'm still on page 272. California played a big part in winning new freedoms for minorities. A minority is a group of people, like an ethnic group, that is a smaller part of the whole population. In Los Angeles, people decided to protest when Otis Jackson could not buy his house. This means they wanted to show the owner and the public that they objected to the way Jackson had been treated. They protested by carrying signs and marching down the streets of the neighborhood. Finally, the owner gave in and agreed to sell Jackson a house. Groups protested against discrimination all over the state. In San Francisco, people protested against a supermarket chain that wouldn't hire blacks. They filled shopping carts with cold and frozen food and left them at checkout lines. But not everyone protested in peaceful ways. In 1965, a violent riot broke out in Los Angeles' neighborhood of Watts. Angry blacks wrecked stores and set fire to many houses. The riot, which left 34 people dead, shocked the nation. People began to see that it was time for change. The work of groups and individuals in California brought about progress for minorities. But the fight is not over. As Congresswoman Yvonne Bratworth Burke put it, our job is before us in making opportunities and a pleasant place for children to live. So there's a picture of Miss Burke in 1972. It says Yvonne Bratworth Burke became the first black woman ever elected to the United States Congress. So there's an answer under essential facts. Before this, she served on the committee that looked into the Watts riots. It says, how did protests help blacks win their civil rights? So we have a couple of questions we can answer. We can answer number 5 on essential facts about Yvonne Bratworth Burke, and we can answer number 4 about Watts. What was Watts? What took place in Watts? We can answer number 4 on the second page. Why did blacks fight for equal rights? Why did they fight for equal rights? Looks like those are the basics. We can obviously answer about Rosa Parks. And I want to tell you that when I was probably in 4th grade, I went on a field trip to Watts Towers. And Watts Towers is in the city of Watts, and it was, honoring what took place in Watts Towers. So maybe you've been there or seen it. But I remember that very distinctly. There were towers made of, I can't exactly remember. I feel like little tiles or even bottle caps or something. It was very artistic, but it was created, and I can't remember all the essentials. I'll look that up, and we'll talk about that in Zoom. But I remember going to Watts Towers. I'll try to find you a picture of it. And some of you, like I said, might have been there. So let's look at page 273 and learn about the migrant farm workers. It says, outside farm workers organize. Outside the cities, in the open fields of California's farms, another group fought for its civil rights. Migrant farm workers led by Cesar Chavez worked together for fair wages and better working conditions. Chavez knew well the hard life of California's migrant laborers. When Chavez was 10 years old, his family had to give up its farm and become migrant workers. They worked long hours in the fields, picking box after box of fruits and vegetables. This was during the Great Depression. Sometimes Chavez's parents did not make enough money in a day to pay the 70-cent bus fare to and from the fields. Didn't even make 70 cents a day. Sometimes it says, Chavez remembers walking along the highway with his brother looking for the tinfoil from cigarette packs. They gathered the foil in a ball and sold it to junk dealers. Okay, so just cigarettes. A lot of people smoked back in the day, and the cigarette boxes had tinfoil. The cigarettes were placed in the tinfoil within the box, and he and his brother would go and gather foil that they found in the street, and they'd put it in balls to sell to the junk dealers. Anything to make some money. It's a hard life, a poor life. Being poor was not the only hardship migrant laborers faced. Families moved often in their search for work. So migrant means to move from place to place. Because of this, their children did not receive a good education. Chavez himself attended over 35 schools and only got through the 8th grade. So imagine going to 35 different schools because your family is constantly moving to be able to survive, and by picking fruits and vegetables and stuff in places like Bakersfield and Fresno and along like the Central California farm country, moving all those times. Migrant laborers also made low wages, meaning they didn't make a lot of money. Many growers charge workers high rents to live in rundown shacks and high prices for the food they ate. Not fair. On one farm, the field boss made workers pay 75 cents for a glass of water, just a glass of water. 25 cents for a glass of water. So they would live in shacks out in the fields, but they charge high rent for the shacks, and they charge more money for food to live off. So that was a way that they literally, that's just another way to discriminate and disservice these people, okay? So they're working their tails off for less than 70 cents a day out in the hot fields in Central California, and then they overcharge them to live in shacks and to for food, and 25 cents for a glass of water. So these people couldn't get out of their poverty because they had to pay so much for everything. So here's a picture of Chavez standing beside a grape field. It says, Chavez protests with migrant laborers. The protest sign and the Union flag pictured below say huelga. That means strike in Spanish. So there, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm not sure. So we can answer about Cesar Chavez. Well, no, he's coming up. But we can answer on page 2, number 3, what minority groups protested against unfair treatment during the 1960s and 70s. So, so far, we've seen how Indians fought for the land in Alcatraz, to live in Alcatraz, and blacks and migrant workers. So find your answer that talked about those 3 groups. And we're going to be able to answer the rest of these questions real quick here. It says, organizing the people. Chavez wanted to improve the lives and working conditions of the migrant laborers, but he knew he could not do it alone. So he drove from town to town and talked to all the people that would listen. Chavez wanted to organize migrant laborers into a group to work toward a shared goal. He felt that if he organized or gathered enough people together, they would grow powerful enough to win their rights. The idea, Chavez explained, was like picking grapes. Chavez convinced enough workers to form a labor union. I'm on the next page. A labor union is a group of workers joined together to protect their rights. Workers who don't belong to a union can lose their jobs if they complain about being treated unfairly. But union members know the union will stand behind them. So again, a labor union is a group of workers that join together to protect their rights. They're in it through thick and thin. Okay? Here, I want to go back because I didn't read Chavez's comment up there. So I'm going to go back. It says Chavez explained, he felt that if he organized or gathered enough people together, they would grow powerful enough to win their rights. The idea, Chavez explained, was like picking grapes. Quote, if you talk to people, you're going to organize them. But people aren't going to come to you. You have to go to them. It takes a lot of work. When you pick grapes, so remember he says it's like picking grapes, you pick a bunch at a time. Eventually you pick the whole vineyard. Organizing is no different. So you go to the people and get groups of people at a time and bring them all together. And then we talked about organizing these labor unions where people would stick together to protect their rights. The grape boycott. In 1965, Chavez, his sister-in-law Dolores Huerta, and the union organized grape pickers to strike. They joined Filipinos who were already striking and refused to do any more work until the growers had agreed to what the union wanted. The workers demanded better pay and better working conditions. The growers refused to deal with the union. So the growers were who own those fields and whatnot. They can't harvest those fruits and vegetables on their own. They need the migrant workers. So now they're at a standstill. They need to listen to what these migrant workers are fighting for, and what the migrant workers are fighting for are very just and fair and honorable reasons. So then Chavez asked the public to join in a grape boycott. This meant that people could support the union strike by refusing to buy or eat grapes. So that would cause the people who own the grape vineyards to go broke because nobody's buying or eating their grapes anymore. Okay, it's kind of like the bus boycott. Shut down the buses because nobody's riding them. They lose money. Across the country, other unions and church groups joined the boycott. Even dock workers stopped loading grapes onto ships. By 1970, most grape growers had agreed to deal with the union. For a time, farm workers received better pay and working conditions. Remember, that's what the union was fighting for. But many growers did not sign union contracts until a few years later. Seasonal farm workers today still struggle for their rights. And here we have a picture. This graph below shows that Hispanic people, sorry, I thought you could see that. I'm right here. Hispanic people are California's largest minority group. Hispanics are people whose families are originally from Spanish-speaking countries. And here we see the ethnic population, the amount of Native Americans, African Americans, Hispanic, whites, Asian Pacific Islanders. People joined the boycott and wore buttons like the one pictured at the right, this boycott button. And how did migrant laborers force owners to improve the conditions for laborers on California's farms? So we know that was the bus boycott. So we can answer all of our questions. We can answer about Cesar Chavez and the Great Boycott, number 6 and 7, in under Essential Facts on page 1. And on page 2, we can answer number 5. How did Cesar Chavez help the farm workers? We can answer number 2, the largest ethnic group in California. Okay, so you should do well on this. We've gone through all of it, and I look forward to seeing good results.